Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Today, inshallah, we're going to actually be taking the third segment in understanding morality in Islam. And just to recap on what we did last time, we did talk about the basis, the
Recording in progress.
the basis of morality in Islam, and we talked about the legal maxims. So, the legal maxims in Islam are really important to understand because they act as the founding base and they act as the pillars that hold up morality in Islam, that define ethics. So everything in Islam, everything in terms of legislature, actually goes back to these legal maxims. And the legal maxims I did mention before that I put them, although it says acronym idiom, but it's actually an acronym. In the acronym that I personally put forward, but it's not based on my opinion. It's actually based on the foundations that the scholars had actually derived from reviewing the Quran and Sunnah and put it in that order, in where the legal maxims in Islam are really in that prioritization form, in where prioritizing spirituality and deen as the most important ethical part of the religion, and the second part is preserving life, whether it is the individual life or whether we're speaking about the public life as well. So that's the second, that would act as the second priority. The third priority is preserving mind, preserving chastity and family, and preserving wealth. Now, we did talk about some of those things, so I'm not going to go over them, but it's really important to remember that when we're speaking about spirituality, and usually in philosophy of ethics, religion, because in secularism they don't necessarily regard, or in fact religion is not regarded whatsoever as the basis to understanding ethics. That is why usually religion, or in general, is actually talked about as not related to understanding ethics. In fact, it is actually seen as the opium of civilization. And in the times of the secular postmodern times that we're living in, religion is seen as that place that takes people backwards and not take them forward. So when we're talking about Islam, we're looking at a totally different angle, and where it actually considers that ethics start from the way and the purpose that you actually view life in. So the Lord Almighty is basically the start. La ilaha illallah is the start of understanding ethics, because you are going back to the purpose that preceded the essence. That is, of course, the essence that preceded life, and therefore you're looking through the lens of the Lord Almighty being the one to define ethics for you, being the one to define morality for you, and being the one to go back to, even in reward. So it's not enough to just look at ethics as, yes, it's just me trying to be good because I want to be good, but it's actually more than that, in where you are trying to live up to being good, or up to the principle, in order to get rewarded for that good by the Lord Almighty. Which is why when you look at atheism, not considering morality as an objective morality, or as something to be rewarded for, is basically the main weakness. And why, when you look at mental health and you look at a number of different oppression statistics and anxiety, it actually increases when you don't feel that there is a reward for this. There is accountability for what we're doing, whether good to pay back for the good that was done, or whether the bad to retaliate and compensate for the oppressed ones, and what they will be getting instead of this life. And which is why when we look at the second segment, when we're looking at preserving the nafs as being the second part, in where the Lord Almighty actually actually indicates, of course, that not only preserving life in health, but also preserving life in not even committing suicide or not even in attacking other one's life. So I'm not going to focus so much on that because we've done that before. So the other part, preserving aql in three different things. Number one is preserving mind and health, and preserving the health of your brain, the health of your mind, the health of your focus, and being sober and making sure that you're actually awake for the purpose that you were created for. You're awake for the test, which is why the Lord Almighty prohibited drugs, alcohol, or anything that may lead to intoxication. Preserving healthy understandings is also included in that, and which is unfortunately very important to mention that during our times there's so much focus on our children getting degrees in order to get a good life, but then when it comes to studying Islam, we unfortunately in our times it's seen as a secondary issue and not a main issue. So we would get children where their parents are taking them out of a Quran class because they might have a soccer game. The strangest one that I was really shocked by is when a mother actually took her daughter out of the Quran class that I was teaching because she wanted her to take ballet classes. Unfortunately, this is real, and it's subhanallah. It is sending the child a message to tell them that Quran and learning Islam is secondary, while probably ballet classes or piano lessons or hockey or whatever it is actually more important. I know that in our society, when, at least here in the US, when you take such classes, you might actually get extra credit, and those credits might actually pay back and pay off when you decide to go to college. But then, just a question to ask ourselves: do we necessarily view the credits that we as Muslims want to attain based on Western vision of what makes something credit worthy or what makes something more valuable? Is something that we really have to review. Many times we may not realize how we're sucked in the Western slash secular postmodern lifestyle that is really based on dunya. So this is something that we really have to consider, that when we're speaking of preserving healthy understanding, we're actually talking about even more than what you focus on making sure that your child or yourself are getting good grades to get a good college degree or probably get a scholarship. Getting a scholarship in the akhirah is more important. Don't whatsoever make your child feel, or you feel, that learning Islamic studies is a secondary thing. It is actually more important because it relates to their akhirah and this dunya. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna nahnu narithu al-ard, that in the end the Lord Almighty will inherit the earth and everything, وَمَنْ عَلَيْهَا وَإِلَيْنَا يُرْجَعُونَ, everything that's on it, and in the end you will return to the Lord Almighty. So all the money, all the accomplishments that you gained in the dunya, they're at the end just going to be part of a dunya credit. Focus on the akhirah credit. Akhirah credit by teaching yourself and the children that when you learn Islam, you're actually learning something that is getting you stronger in this dunya and in the akhirah. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't focus on your children's grades. No, absolutely not. Focus on their grades. Absolutely. It's helping them in their dunya. When you're actually getting a scholarship, it's a lot better than trying to figure out interest and trying to make a college tuition possible. I totally agree with you on that. But I'm talking about here focusing also on teaching the children that learning your deen is even more important than that. Preserving chastity and preserving chastity is probably one of the hardest things, because we're talking about it is part of our own nature, because it's actually the strongest addiction. sexuality tends to be one of the strongest addictions after, of course, different addictions. That's why when you look at the different addictions in where alcohol and of course, the stronger that alcohol and that intoxication, the drug, the stronger it is in affecting our brain, the more expensive it is. And of course, the more expensive it is, the stronger it is. And of course, in the end, it becomes even a bigger addiction. And that's why when we're looking at the strong addictions, it's really important to consider having even a conversation with your children, with your children who are, by this age, when we're talking about preserving idol and etc. We're talking about right now older children, to have a really transparent conversation on things like marriage, or things to help them live up to that utopian. In our times, it's considered utopian to actually abstain from anything that is haram, whether it's befriending outside of marriage, or even engaging with the opposite, with engaging with the opposite sex, etc. This is really common within our times, and to actually not engage in that is actually considered too utopian in our times, because life is actually based on such entertainment, and which is why when we're looking at what Islam regarded as sacred, which is family, regarded that anything that leads to the path of any relations outside of marriage is actually considered prohibited, and is actually considered as unethical. And this is really important when we teach our children. So why is things like LGBT or zina actually haram? Isn't that part of human nature? Well, absolutely. When we're talking about relations between sexes, it's actually part of our nature. There's no doubt about that. But Islam wanted to ensure people's rights, because you cannot ensure that child's rights and ensure the individual rights, and even the wife's rights, the husband's rights, the child's rights, even before they are born, unless you actually make sure that there is this contract, or this great bond, this covenant, this bond that every other side respects, that we are here taking it seriously. This is to ensure the child's rights, to ensure the wife's rights, the father's rights, and not only that, but even the families involved understand that there is a responsibility that they also have to take in making this marriage happen, or in future circumstances, that when the father or mother go into dispute, etc., that the family needs to take on a responsibility to make sure that we're trying to reconciliate or do the necessary means to maintain a family, because family is extremely sacred in Islam, because it is the foundation of society. It's the foundation of society. If the foundation of society starts wearing off, starts breaking, then the society itself, one after another, it becomes like a broken brick. It becomes like a broken fortress. Any fortress or any brick, any building starts with actually putting strong pillars. Family is the foundation of a strong fortress, of a strong community, of a strong country. In the end, anything that goes outside of that direction, whether we're talking about zina, or whether we're talking about anything outside of husband and wife, man and woman in a marriage bond, is actually considered haram. It is actually considered not only haram, but actually an attack on the main pillar and the foundation of what makes family, which is why Islam had actually increased even punishment when it related to sexual relations practiced outside of marriage, practiced by somebody that had a previous marriage experience compared to somebody that didn't have a marriage experience. Why did it increase it there? Well, because you are more likely to get into the gravity after having an experience than somebody with no experience. So Islam increased the punishment in order to increase the power to keep you and abstain you away from such an engagement. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually said, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا. Do not approach zina. Zina is adultery or fornication. So it includes both married and those that don't have a marriage experience. وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا. Don't approach zina. What does it mean to not approach? Anything that might lead to that area is actually considered as unethical, whether that was through online or whether that was through in person or whether that was through chatting or whether that was through images, in different ways, in where if it excites a certain feeling, that is outside of the marriage relationship, that would actually mean it is actually considered not only haram but extremely unethical, because it leads to a very very dangerous thing that may harm a very important pillar in Islam. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ actually said, speaking to the men, speaking to the youth, speaking also to the women are going to be included here, whoever is capable of getting married, then do so, because it is a main thing that helps you lower your gaze and even guard your private parts. And if you're not capable of doing so, then use fasting as a form of therapy to help you control your lust. Now, when we're looking at the number of different ethical things that relate to this category, preserving ird or preserving chastity, we're looking at anything that leads to it. So not lowering the gaze, it's considered unethical because of where it might lead to. Now, that doesn't mean that it is unethical, or it would be unethical only if it led to that. No, because in Islam, whether you are able to control yourself or whether you're not able to control yourself, in the end, the Lord Almighty actually made it clear in where He said, قُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ. In other words, it's not related to how strong you're able to control your lust from seeing these images or probably engaging with certain people. It's actually in itself obligatory to lower the gaze, because in the end, you as a human being, you would turn to the Lord Almighty to lay out the ethics for you. And as a human being, the principle of lowering the gaze is actually in itself a form of worship. It's a form of ibadah, because worship is a lot more comprehensive than just a ritual. Worship is more comprehensive than just practicing it in the masjid. Worship is actually to be practiced in the masjid, in public, in school, and even when you're at home, sitting in front of a screen and no one's seeing you. It is all considered worship. And which is why when we're looking at other things like forbidding abortion is basically part of preserving ird and part of preserving family. Somebody might say, well, we've got a case by case. You can call that, call the muftis, and they'll go into different rulings based on case by case. Now, preserving family is part of preserving chastity, and which is why Islam considered that in order to preserve even morality down the road in terms of preserving social relations, that's why it actually started out with what and who your father is, who your mother is, and how you relate with them, because preserving family is actually the core of every single social relations. The Lord Almighty actually laid out that in order to get to number one, the Lord Almighty decreed that you would only worship Him, and for both parents, you would treat them with kindness. And even when one may grow old, do not use words of uff or any form of a word that may seem condescending to them. And always speak in words of kindness. Now, that is not only in the way you relate with your parents, but that's also in the way you relate with the children, which is why the Lord Almighty actually considered that when we're talking about child adoption, the Lord Almighty actually emphasized that it is important that every child would actually have the right to know who their parent is. And in fact, the name that they should be attributed to is the name to their own biological fathers, and not a name that one may create in for them, but you would actually call them by their biological fathers to remind them that at the end, that is their biological father, and to remind them that in the end, they have a responsibility towards them. What if they left them? What if they put them out for adoption? At the end, there is something that the Lord Almighty had laid the foundation of, which is the truth of the matters, regardless of what one might have committed. Now, the other part, when we're laying out ethics, when we're laying out morality, not only are we laying out the foundation of mother, father, child, and his relationship with the family, but we're also really laying out the relationship of brothers, sisters, and aunts and uncles, and there is a special relationship even within that area in where there is a special responsibility. Your responsibility towards your brothers and sisters is different than the responsibility you might have towards your friends or towards strangers, and which is why the Lord Almighty actually said, وَأُولُو الْأَرْحَامِ بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلَى بِبَعْضٍ فِي كِتَابِ اللَّهِ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُهَاجِرِينَ. In the end, there is a special relationship that the Lord Almighty is putting it on a will on you, that if, when we're talking about blood relations, there is a special responsibility and special rights that are to be considered above any other bond, above any other relationship. Now, the fifth one is preserving, and when we're talking about the ethics of preserving wealth, we're actually looking at a number of different things. What is ethical in regarding wealth, the way how that income is actually brought in. So in Islam, it is considered of a very important thing that when we speak about ethics, when we speak about morality, we're actually looking at not only protecting your wealth, but you're protecting it from how you got the wealth, how you spend it, how you're spending the wealth, and you're also looking at the accountability that relates to others' responsibilities or others' rights relating to that wealth. So when we're looking at wealth, we're speaking about how that income is brought, how it's spent, and of course protecting other people's wealth from yourself probably is another thing, in where you're protecting others' wealth, just like as you would want others to protect your wealth. This is very different from the categorical imperative that Kant was talking about, because in the end, in Islam, it actually considers that there is something even farther than just dealing with how do we understand people relating to my wealth, but this is also talking about how the income is brought, including usury or interest, is actually haram, even though there might be consent. So the consent that might be there is not always necessarily the key thing to be within that with a trade of wealth in order to make something halal. This is really important, because in secular understanding of ethics, if there is consent, everyone is agreeing to it, well, it should be fine. Well, not necessarily in Islam. Not consent is important, absolutely, in Islam, but it's not what defines something to being halal money versus haram money. Consent is not the only thing. There are other related regulations that act as pivotal regulations in order to make sure to ensure that wealth is bringing in is bringing in prosperity to the society, is bringing in justice, and is bringing in the relations to be in a way that preserves rights. Which is why when we look at, for example, gambling, a person might go to a casino, for example. They definitely went with their own complete consent, complete free will, and they went there, but they didn't win. So Islam will consider that as unethical, whether they won or not, and will consider the money as haram, because at the end of the day, this money was not there to create prosperity for the society, but it was there to let the money basically distribute and jump from one hand to another with no prosperity, with no power, with no change to the society in order to bring about stability in relations, or even to bring about more and more prosperity within the society. So protection for the second part, which is protection for others' wealth, well, forbid stealing, scamming, etc. Even, of course, when one might actually not have been discovered, but in the end, considered that as immoral. And of course, protection for communities' wealth. Zakah was regarded as not one's right, but actually the other person's right. In other words, this money that is zakah money, you might consider that it's my money and I'm giving it to you. But in fact, Islam actually considered that zakah money is not actually your money, but it is money that others have the right over within your money. Now, it's really important to mention a number of things here. When we're talking about morality, it's really important to understand who you are and what your weaknesses are. Because if you don't understand what your weaknesses are, you're sure going to fall within this. Just like when we're talking about illnesses and diseases, they'll tell you, well, we've got COVID that is going on the rise here, so they'll tell you the different things, the different precautions, the different measurements you should consider, whether it's masking or whatever it is, in order to make sure that you don't contract those viruses. Well, that's the same thing. In Islam, it's not any different, in where it's telling you that, hey, you've got a nafs that could easily absorb from the lifestyle that surrounds it. So it's telling you you've got a nafs that is already, that nafs acts as the combination of your own physical creation. It acts also as your own emotional creation. In other words, it acts as the part of nature that is built within you, whether it's physical, whether it's psychological, emotional, you name it. In the end, is that there's a built-in natural thing within you that gets attracted to those elements. For example, it's part of your own nature that you're attracted to wanting more money. Why? Because you understand with time that money is going to give you better opportunities and less struggles. So you would want more money because you associate more money to less struggles. You would associate more money to better houses, better cars, better opportunities, and then therefore it's part of your nature to want more money. Now, it's part of your nature to also probably want fame. It's part of your nature because you would consider that more fame, it's actually going to pave the way more appreciation and of course more authority. And of course the list goes on and on. It's part of your own nature without you realizing, which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually explained to us right there that in nafs ammara bisu, that your own nature, which is here laid out as in nafs, is ammara bisu. It is constantly ordering you to do the wrong thing. Why? Because it wants things in an easier way, so it will pressure you to find easier means in order to live life easier and to find life more pleasureful. And that's why you also may feel the guilt. So you've got another side of your nafs. Now, scholars had differences of opinions. It's worthy of mention here. They had differences of opinions on whether these points in nafs al-ammara bis-su', nafs al-lawama, or nafs al-mutma'inna, whether that is in each and every single one of us, or whether that is a stage that each and every single one might have reached. So a person might have the control of a nafs al-ammara bis-su'. Another person has elevated themselves and they had passed the nafs al-ammara bis-su'. They had passed the level of this nafs that's constantly pressuring them doing the wrong thing, and then past the level of constantly feeling guilty and needing to correct oneself, and they actually reach the level of nafs al-mutma'inna, the nafs that is living in tranquility, the nafs that is living in content, the nafs that is living based on the principle. Is that in all of us, or is that a stage that we have to go up to? So you can understand it in both ways. Scholars had differences of opinions anyways. So your goal in the end is to reach in nafs al-mutma'inna. If you look at the word in nafs al-mutma'inna, what does that mean? Well, let's go back over here, because in nafs al-ammara bis-su', right now, it's part of our nature that we want to keep out from different dangers or different challenges. It's part of our nature. It's part of our animal nature too. In animals, staying away from danger or staying away from challenges is seen even in monkeys, is seen even in squirrels. You look at them on the trees and they're always trying to keep everything for themselves, and etc. Even if it means an acorn that they will later just take and bury. But in the end is that they would consider that, hey, it's a gain at the end of the day. But in the end, in where nafs al-mutma'inna is not to mean that you're keeping your nafs totally succumbed, but it actually means balancing. Here's the key. In nafs al-mutma'inna is putting in a balance between your physical desires, your emotional desires, and living up to the principle. That the principle itself. So Islam is not telling you to mortify your needs. Islam is not telling you not to seek money, or not to seek a good life, or not to seek it, or not to seek pleasure. It's not telling you to mortify your body either. It's not telling you don't do this in everything, but it's actually telling you do it in a way where you live in balance. So it's living a balanced life, and that balanced life is what is going to give you that tranquility. That tranquility cannot be attained unless you live in balance. Living in balance actually requires the knowledge to what is balance. You as a human being yourself, you can't necessarily know what balance is by just your own ego or just by your own individual thinking, because you as an individual, you can think that such an idea is coming from my logic, when in reality it could be your own selfishness, it could be your own desire, it could be your own physical body. There's no way to be able to distinguish on where that idea is coming from. In the end, your body is doing all the function and you do all those different things, and you're not really sure, was that coming from my logic? And of course, even your logic might make mistakes, even in the way that it evaluates something, or even in the conclusion, in how and what, in the way that interpret different data. Now, that's the same thing when we're looking at the way we understand the world around us is what is the principle that we should live in. And that's why the Lord Almighty actually sent us Sharia. فَلِذَلِكَ فَادْعُ وَاسْتَقِمْ كَمَا أُمِرْتَ وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ أَهْوَاءَهُم. 3 different things. فَلِذَلِكَ فَادْعُ. Let that be the slogan. Let that be the principle that you live based on. وَاسْتَقِمْ كَمَا أُمِرْتَ. And you istaqim. Istaqim means you live based on that Sharia. Don't teach it to others and you will not live by it. No, استقم كما أمرت. You yourself live based on it. ولا تتبع أهواءهم. They will pressure you in order to live based on their lifestyle. ولا تتبع أهواءهم. Don't follow their footsteps. Don't follow the pressure in wanting you to fit in. ولا تتبع أهواءهم. And when we're looking at a nafs al-mutma'inna, that's exactly what you need to get to. You need to get to the level of you're living based on the Lord Almighty, the principles of the Lord Almighty, and not based on the principles that your body might pressure you to live in. So know yourself, in other words, in order to make sure that you know how to elevate your akhlaq, whether it's in having the confidence in knowing who you are and what the purpose and the essence of your life is. And of course, remember that there are weaknesses that you have to admit that you have, and you have to remember that those weaknesses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows already about you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you the amount that suits you to live in harmony between your body, your mind, and your psychology. There are different things in us, and we cannot forget about these three different things: our own emotions, our own body, and our own mind, and of course our spirituality. Now, when you look at yourself, there are a number of different desires that may control you, and of course control your principles. And that's why by being Muslim, it actually means submitting your desires to the divine principles and not the opposite way. Let's do it again. You're submitting your desires to the divine principles and not changing or reiterating the divine principles to suit your desires. That's what Christians, Jews, and different religions have actually done. They have reinterpreted or changed the divine principles in order to suit what people want, and that way they won't feel the guilt. Now, here there are a number of different things where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had actually mentioned all those 5 different acronyms that we talked about: preserving deen, nafs, aql, ird, mal, etc. And you can go back to Surah Al-Isra right there from ayah 23 to 36. I would have translated, maybe I can translate it really quick. And your Lord Almighty decreed that you do not worship but Him, and you would treat your parents kindly. And if they reach an older age, whether one of them or both of them, do not say words of any condescending words or words that may have, of course, the body language where it means you're condescending them, and do not condescend them and tell them good kind words, and be humble with your parents and give them mercy, and make the invocation to the Lord Almighty. O Lord Almighty, irhamhuma, grant them mercy as they had raised me when I was a child. Your Lord Almighty knows what is within you. If you are pious, He, the Lord Almighty, for those that are pious and repent to Him, He is most forgiving. And give to the relatives their rights, and the needy and the indigents and those that are on journey, and do not وَلَا تُبَذِّرْ تَبْذِيرًا. In other words, don't what is the word? What tubadir tabdira is more where you're not spending wealth in its place. In other words, you're wandering money. Do not wander money, because those that wander money are the brethren of shayateen, brethren of the devil, and the shaitan himself was one that rejected his Lord Almighty. And when one seeks the mercy of their Lord Almighty, then say good kind words and easy words, and do not let your hand, this is more of an idiom in where it's saying don't live in such selfishness and greed, and don't let your hand be overspending, and then you may find yourself regretting all the money when you need it, of course, that you did not spend it in its its place. Your Lord Almighty gives the wealth for whom He wills, and He gives it in a specific amount. He, the Lord Almighty, is more aware and is more aware of His servants. And do not kill your own children. In other words, abortion, or even literally killing your own children in fear of poverty, because the Lord Almighty is the one that gives the provisions and gives you the provisions, and killing them is a major sin. Do not approach zina. Do not approach fornication or adultery, as it is a major transgression against the Lord Almighty. And do not kill oneself. Do not kill any soul unless the Lord Almighty had allowed killing such soul. And whoever was killed in oppression, the Lord Almighty will grant those that are that person's guardians will grant them a power. So let them not transgress the limit in the power that the Lord Almighty had given them. He will give them victory. And do not approach and do not transgress the limits in dealing with the orphan's wealth, unless it is billatihi ahsan, unless you do it for a certain justice and injustice, and of course in good terms, until they reach the age of maturity, and act and live based on promises and the principles, for those principles will be what you will be held accountable for. And when you use the scales, then make sure that you actually weigh injustice, because that is living up to the terms, and that is the best way to interpret justice. And don't say what you don't know of, what you don't have knowledge about. Don't speak of things that you don't have knowledge about. In the end, your hearing, your seeing, your heart, all that, in other words, your intention as well, you will be asked about it. Now, I want you to look at this ayah. The reason why I wanted to translate it was really for us to see. Remember the acronyms that I laid out earlier? This is in order to say and lay out that the Quran, and this is in Surah Al-Isra, you guys, if you actually open the middle of the Quran, this is in the heart of the Quran when we're speaking about relating to, here it is, abstaining from shirk, dealing with your parents. And look at how many ayat we're actually talking about dealing with parents, dealing with the relatives. And notice how it was talking about dealing with the relatives, because many times relatives tend to be the hardest in dealing with, because they may transgress the limit easily. Unlike the strangers, they will give you more respect. But the Quran is actually asking you to be patient in dealing with them. And there's a lot of focus in those ayat on dealing with money and how you relate with money and how you spend money, because morality is also relating to how you spend money and what you use with money. Now, the basis of morality, and our future lectures are really going to be relating to these parts. The basis of morality are actually 4 manners: patience, chastity, courage, and justice. When we're looking at patience, well, that's what leads to forbearance and removing harm. When we're talking about chastity, well, it's actually not chastity, but that was the nearest translation that I can find for iffa, because the word iffa can mean chastity and can mean honor as well, and can also mean self-discipline. So I use the word chastity, but it actually includes a number of different things. I tried to find one word to mean iffa, but like I said, it can mean it can mean chastity, it can mean honor, it can mean self-discipline, all these different things. But at the end, we're going to be making a lecture on each and every single one of those, and how Islam actually discusses these and even trains in these in order to attain morality. So chastity, because it relates to abstaining from illicit behavior, whether in action, speech, and of course and the way we relate to the world around us, and even with ourselves. And of course, courage. I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about manhood, and I'm going to talk about chivalry, inshallah, because this is really important. How do we actually raise that in our children? And because this is really important. If we don't have the courage to live up to the principle, we can easily lose our morality without us realizing. We're going to talk about that later on, inshallah. So, because courage and living up to the courage means preserving your honor and, of course, considering high principles over people. If you don't have the courage to live up to the principle, you will find yourself a coward in living the principle and finding yourself living to the desires of people, and the people, them determining what you actually live based on because you didn't have the courage to practice the principle. Justice. And when we're looking at justice, of course, it's a very broad, very comprehensive term, but we also have to talk about that because when we're living in justice, we're living the principle over the ego and materialistic gain. Remember, it's part of our nature, part of our nafs, that we want materialistic gain. Materialistic gain could be materialistic, literally materialistic, well, that's wealth or authority or whatever it is, and could be a moral part in where you're probably getting fame or etc. So you're getting some kind of a not necessarily materialistic, but it's more of a mundane, something for this world. And of course, that's to feed the ego. Now, the other part, and when we're talking about the basis of immorality, on the other hand, the basis of immorality is actually going in a number of different things. So we're talking about, just as the basis of morality is patience, chastity, and what was it, courage, and what was the other one? So patience, yeah. And the basis of immorality, on the other hand, is ignorance, oppression, desire, and anger. All right, so let's do it again. So the basis of immorality, here we go. It's basically ignorance, in where the person is actually ignorant about understanding ethics and understanding the foundation of ethics, or oppression, in where the person is basically putting themselves and as individuals and putting their own pragmatism, let's say it that way, putting their own benefits over living up to the principle. And of course, that might lead to harming others and lacking balance in considering justice and priority. So that leads to oppression. We'll talk about that as well. And this is really important because in our modern times, the part about living individualism, the part about being pragmatic, considering yourself, considering your own needs as the priority, is actually the mother of all oppressions. And that's why we're actually living, even though we don't want to believe that, although we are told that we are living the best times of what humanity has ever lived in. But the reality is, we're actually living the worst times of what humanity has probably ever lived in, because we're not just oppressing the society, but we could actually see how whether it's killing, or whether it's stealing, or whether it's the children and losing children and etc., is actually on the rise by the year and is not getting less, which is actually telling us that crime is actually growing, and that when we actually want to think that we're living in the era of understanding, or the era of science and education, think again. The other part, which is desire, because desire, and of course, if we're living based on desire, that's going to lead to greed, illicit behavior, and going low in principle. Sorry for the typo here. The other part, which is anger, and of course, when we're talking about immorality and the basis of immorality, anger leads to arrogance, pride, hate, envy, animosity, attacking others, and of course, safa, dishonor. We're going to talk about, inshallah, about each and every single one of these as the basis for every single class. It's right now 11:53, but inshallah, we'll be talking about those in the future one by one. So here's a question. Is morality something we are born with, or is it acquired? I've actually, in order to answer this question, I've actually laid out a number of different hadiths here. Number one is that the Prophet ﷺ, there was the Sahabi, so the story goes as follows. This Sahabi, Abdul Qais, he actually came with a group of different Sahaba. Now, you want to keep in mind is that whenever they would go in the city, they would, when the Prophet ﷺ is there, they would rush to kiss the Prophet ﷺ's hand, to embrace the Prophet ﷺ, to hug the Prophet ﷺ, anything to get close to the Prophet ﷺ. Well, Al-Ashaj didn't do that. He actually went home, cleansed himself, wore something nice and best clothes, and then came to the Prophet ﷺ to embrace him. So the Prophet ﷺ sees Al-Ashaj and he says, إِنَّ فِيكَ لَخِصْلَتَيْنِ يُحِبُّهُمَ اللَّهُ الْحِلْمُ وَالْأَنَا. You have two qualities that the Lord Almighty loves in you: forbearance and gentleness. But here's another narration in where the Prophet ﷺ was actually asked by Al-Ashaj, and he's so smart. Look at how smart he is. And he said, are those two traits, qualities that I raised myself in? In other words, did I discipline myself into these qualities, or were they qualities that were created in me? Think of it as a DNA. They didn't know anything about genetics at the time, but clearly they knew that there were some traits that are passed on from generation to generation. In other words, what we recognized as today genetics. And then the Prophet ﷺ actually responds to that question. He said, بَلْ خُلُقَيْنِ جُبِلْتَ عَلَيْهِمَا. They're actually traits that created in you. They were created in you. In other words, they're actually part of your making. They're part of your genetics without you realizing. So he responded, Alhamdulillah, all praise is due to the Lord Almighty who created me on attributes and qualities that the Lord Almighty and His Messenger love in me. Now, here's the thing. Does that mean that we can't necessarily grow or learn new qualities because anyways they're part of our genetics? You would find in a certain family they're just all generous. In another family they just happen to be extremely greedy. In another family they're just always so low-tempered. They're just easily tempered, easily provoked, etc. And you will find it. The father, the children, they're just easily tempered like that. And you will find another family in where they're just really happy, easygoing, etc. Always like that. And you will find a family that the whole family is just always blue and is always just complaining about how everything just happens to target their life. And they're just complaining that they're just always not fortunate enough to get a good, happy life. You've got these people and you've got those kind of people. But here's the thing. If that was something that you were created in other words, a quality that was created in you, and you can't control changing it, the following hadith would actually tell us otherwise. Let's say the Prophet ﷺ, that in the hadith that was narrated by Muslim, that the Prophet ﷺ actually used to make the dua and say, وَهْدِنِي لِأَحْسَنِ الْأَخْلَاقِ لَا يَهْدِي لِأَحْسَنِهَا إِلَّا أَنْتِ وَاصْرِفْ عَنِّي سَيِّئَهَا لَا يَصْرِفُ عَنِّي سَيِّئَهَا إِلَّا أَنْتِ. The Prophet ﷺ would make the dua, Ya Allah, guide me to the best of morality. No one guides to the best of it except you. And keep the worst of morals away from me, because no one can keep the worst of the morals except you. Now, another thing is that we are held accountable for our actions. If we're held accountable for our actions, then that would actually mean it is within our power. So there could be certain actions and certain things that you may be asked to do or asked to abstain from, but that's where the jihad of the nafs actually happens. You vary in fitna, in the trials, in the weaknesses, because of number one, genetics making, number two, probably the environment that you're living in. So we know, for example, somebody that let's say their mother was taking intoxicants. We know that that affects their brains. It affects even the making when they were babies. It affects their ability to have certain control over certain behaviors. Well, here's the thing. That doesn't mean they're not held accountable, because the people actually vary in the fitna. So, yes, you may have, let's say, different factors that make you weaker in probably practicing certain things. So, children that grew up, let's say, in a home that is less religious actually have actually have it, let's say, harder than actually a home that built in the discipline in those children. Now, the same thing in where that does not give us the excuse. So we vary in the fitna, and we vary in the trials, and we vary in the weaknesses we may face. But in the end, we're still held accountable, and the Lord Almighty will actually reward you based on the effort that you put in. So if you put in more effort to change that immorality that you are struggling with, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you even more than the person that is finding it easier to live based on that morality. And this is really important to mention. Is it easy to acquire a new moral? Well, habits take time to change. New habits may need teachers and supporters to spot what needs to be changed and how to change it. And that's why having pious friends is important to help you recognize and support you in what needs to be changed. And piety changes many manners. In other words, religious consciousness, taqwa, actually helps you attain the different moralities, the different manners that you want to learn. Now, it's really important to mention that on the top of that, I'll end it with this hadith. The Prophet ﷺ actually used to make the dua, and I'll end the lecture with that dua. The Prophet ﷺ used to make the dua and say the dua in where he would say the words in where O Allah Almighty, make me love those masakin, and Ya Allah, make me abstain from the haram, even though you would know the haram. Allahumma inni as'aluka fi'l al-khayrat. Ya Allah, I ask you to give me the ability to do what is good. Wa tark al-munkarat, and to abstain from immorality. Wa hubb al-masakin, and the love for the needy, and the love for those that are in need and for the poor. And this is a dua that the Prophet ﷺ was teaching us as the basis to learn how to attain and to live based on morality. This, inshallah, is going to be the start. In next week, we'll be talking about patience. What is patience? How do we attain patience? And what is patience to be practiced in? And is it okay to actually, or does it contradict patience to actually use it as a form of therapy to complain and tell others about it? And tell others about our pains and etc. And I don't know, breaking the things around you. Does that contradict patience, or how do we understand it? So this and inshallah other topics are to be discussed next week. And jazakumullah khairan. I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any questions right now. Go ahead. Let's start taking in Sister Huma. If you can unmute the people that would like to speak, I'd be happy to hear them speak. I guess no one wants to say anything. All right. So we'll end right there. And jazakumullah khairan everyone for attending. We'll see you all next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.